My name is Daniel. I'm 27, and if there's one thing I've always disliked, it's night trains. They feel like suspended time, stale air thick with the faint stench of metal, coffee, and something indefinably old. The muffled groan of wheels that never stop. Strangers sitting too close in dim light, their eyes glazed from fatigue. A moving cage, some might call it. Yet despite all my distaste, life sometimes insists on night travel. This time was no different. It was almost midnight when I stepped into the carriage. Rain was pouring down outside, hammering against the glass in sharp, restless fingers. The platform was slick and shining, dotted with tired passengers and their luggage. I carried only one bag, but it felt heavier than it should have, maybe because of the weight of the hours ahead. The air inside the train smelled faintly of brewed coffee, drifting in from a service wagon somewhere further down. The scent wrapped around me as I walked down the narrow corridor, peering at compartment numbers until I found mine. My shoes echoed faintly against the metallic floor, in rhythm with the steady clatter of rain against the windows. I slid the door open. She was already there. A young woman sat by the window, dressed simply in a light sweater, her legs curled slightly beneath her. A pair of white earphones trailed from her ears, and in her hands she held a book, though she wasn't reading at that exact moment. She raised her eyes when the door opened. Our gazes met briefly. For an instant, everything about the train, the hum of electricity in the ceiling, the damp smell of coats, the faint shuddering of the wheels, blurred into the background. Her eyes were calm, steady, the kind that held attention without trying. Then, as if to break the silence, she gave me a small nod and the gentlest of smiles. I stepped inside, clearing my throat awkwardly. "Hi," I said. My voice sounded too loud for the narrow compartment. She lowered her gaze back to the book, but the smile lingered as if she'd tucked it away for later. I placed my bag on the overhead shelf and sat across from her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Only the rain and the rails did, filling the air with a strange, rhythmic music. Night trains have a way of isolating you. The outside world dissolves into darkness, while inside, you're forced into proximity with strangers you might never see again. That knowledge sat heavily in the air as I studied the compartment, the dim lamp above, the worn upholstery, the faint trembling of the glass. And then, inevitably, my attention shifted back to her. She wasn't reading. Not really. Her fingers rested on the book's edge, but her gaze had drifted toward the window, following the blur of raindrops as they slid down the glass. Her hair caught the dim yellow light, strands glowing softly against the shadowed interior. The train jolted, and the motion swayed her just slightly, like she belonged to the rhythm of the rails. I hated night trains. Always had. Yet sitting there, watching her, I began to sense, faintly, almost against my will, that this night might prove different. Something had shifted the moment I opened that door. Something I couldn't quite name, but that pulled me in as strongly as the train pulled us through the darkness. The train rocked gently as it settled into its nocturnal rhythm. A muffled announcement echoed faintly through the corridor, something about the next stop, though I barely caught the words. My attention was elsewhere. The woman across from me still had her book in her lap, but I could see that her eyes were fixed on the rain-streaked window. After a while, she shifted, tugged one earbud out, and glanced at me as though realizing she should acknowledge the presence of the stranger sharing her compartment. Her smile was small, almost tentative, but there was kindness in it. "Long journey ahead?" she asked. Her voice was softer than I expected, carrying just enough warmth to cut through the mechanical hum of the train. "Yeah," I said, exhaling. "I'm not much of a night traveler. I usually avoid trains if I can." That earned a faint laugh from her. "Strange choice, then, to be here tonight." "Strange choice, or bad luck," I admitted. Then, after a pause, I added, "What about you? Do you ride this line often?" She tilted her head, considering. "Sometimes. It's familiar enough that I don't mind the routine. Though," she added with a playful glance, "I wouldn't say I love it either." The tension in the compartment eased. I leaned back against the worn seat, crossing my arms loosely. The rain tapped steadily against the glass, filling the silences between our words. We traded fragments of ourselves, little, harmless pieces at first. She told me about the book in her hand, one she'd started more times than she could count. I told her about a city I was traveling to for work, though I tried to keep the details vague. It was small talk, yes, but it felt different than usual. Her voice had a cadence I found oddly comforting, like a song I couldn't quite place but wanted to keep hearing. Every now and then, she would laugh lightly at something I said, and the sound seemed to linger in the compartment long after it had faded. The lights overhead flickered as the train lurched through a tunnel. For a moment, her face was illuminated in a dim, golden hue, the kind of light that softens edges and hides imperfections. She didn't seem tired like the other passengers I'd seen on the platform. If anything, there was an alertness in her eyes, as though the night belonged to her, and she had simply been waiting for someone to share it with. I caught myself watching her too long and quickly looked away, pretending to study the map above the door. But when I risked another glance, I realized she had noticed. And instead of turning back to her book, she gave me another of those gentle smiles. It was disarming. It was the kind of smile that felt like permission. The rails below clattered on, steady and hypnotic, as though echoing the beat of a heart. The train had settled into its long night rhythm, a steady pulse beneath our feet. Every few minutes it would sway, as though rocking us into an intimacy that neither of us had expected. Outside the window, there was nothing but darkness broken by the occasional flare of a lonely street lamp, blurred by rain. Inside, in this narrow space, the air felt charged, though with what I couldn't yet say. She shifted in her seat, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "So, Daniel," she said, and hearing my name in her voice startled me. I hadn't introduced myself, not aloud, not yet. Maybe she'd glimpsed the tag on my bag when I placed it overhead, or maybe she just guessed. But the way she said it made me feel seen in a way strangers rarely make you feel. "You don't strike me as someone who hates trains," she added. I chuckled. "What do I look like then?" She tilted her head, studying me for a moment, like someone who notices things. People like that don't usually hate the journey, even if they complain about it. Her words left me momentarily speechless. She wasn't wrong. I did notice things. The flicker of carriage lights, the damp coats in the corridor, the faint music leaking from someone's headphones in another compartment. And of course her. I noticed her more than I meant to. "Maybe I just haven't had the right company before," I said finally. That earned me a smile, small, quick, but it reached her eyes. From there, the conversation grew without effort. We moved past polite exchanges into the kind of questions people usually avoid with strangers. The places we would rather be, the regrets we carried quietly, the versions of ourselves that only came out in the dark. She told me about cities she wanted to see: Lisbon, Prague, a coastal town in Greece she'd once read about in a novel. I told her about my younger self's dream of becoming a musician, a dream that had withered into a hobby somewhere along the way. Her laugh came easily, but her silences were just as telling. They weren't awkward. They were full, charged, like pauses in music that make the notes that follow more meaningful. At some point, I realized I was no longer watching the clock or dreading the hours ahead. Time had begun to dissolve. The train could have been moving through any country, any landscape. It didn't matter. All that mattered was the rhythm of our voices weaving something fragile and new. Then the conductor's voice crackled faintly over the intercom, announcing that the lights would soon be dimmed for the night. A few minutes later, the compartment softened into a muted glow. The harshness of day was gone, replaced by something quieter, almost conspiratorial. In that dimness, she leaned her head lightly against the window, her hair brushing her cheek. For the first time, she seemed tired, but she didn't close her eyes. Instead, she turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Strange, isn't it?" she said. "How quickly two strangers can feel less like strangers." Her words hung in the air, delicate like the rain outside. And I thought, yes, strange, and dangerous, and irresistible. The carriage had grown quieter. Somewhere down the corridor, a child was whining softly, soothed by a tired parent's lullaby. But even that sound melted into the larger hush of the night. The conductor had already passed through, extinguishing the overhead lights. All that remained in our compartment was a dim lamp that hummed faintly, its glow a pale circle above us. The train's movement had become hypnotic, that low, constant rhythm that made thoughts wander in ways they never would on solid ground. The wheels against the track beat like a pulse, steady, relentless, alive. She shifted in her seat again, no longer leaning against the window. The sweater she wore looked almost too thin for such a damp night, and she hugged her arms loosely around herself. Our eyes met, briefly, and I realized the distance between us had grown smaller without my noticing. The seats weren't particularly wide, but still, it felt as though something invisible had drawn us closer. The glass rattled as we passed another stretch of empty track. I turned to look out. The rain had eased into a fine drizzle, the droplets no longer hammering but tracing delicate streams across the window. Each passing lamp outside smeared itself into streaks of gold, sliding across the glass before dissolving into darkness again. I found myself tracing their movement, almost forgetting the world beyond them. Then I felt it, a slight brush, her shoulder against mine as the train swayed. It was nothing, really an accident forced by motion and proximity. And yet, when the train settled again, she didn't move away. Her hair, loosened from behind her ear, touched me lightly, a soft tickle against my cheek. The scent of it, faint, clean, something I couldn't name, filled the narrow space between us. I swallowed. My throat felt oddly dry. Words seemed unnecessary, perhaps even dangerous, like they might shatter the fragile calm we had built. She must have felt it too, that suspended moment, because instead of speaking, she slipped one earbud free, coiling the wire around her fingers. With a small, almost conspiratorial tilt of her head, she held it out to me. "Here," she said softly. "Listen." I hesitated only a second before taking it. The music filled my ear immediately, a slow, melodic song, the kind that felt like it had been written for long nights exactly like this. It wasn't about lyrics or instruments. It was about atmosphere, about belonging to a rhythm larger than yourself. And now, with one earbud each, we were sharing that rhythm. Two strangers, shoulder to shoulder in the dim light of a moving train, breathing in time with the same music. The rest of the world shrank until there was nothing outside of this small, rain-touched compartment. Nothing but the pulse of the rails, the echo of the song, and the warmth that had begun to seep quietly into the spaces between us. The melody drifted between us, soft but insistent, filling the silence in ways words never could. Her hand rested loosely in her lap, fingers playing absent-mindedly with the wire of the earphones, as if she too felt the strange intimacy of it. The song wasn't one I knew, but it didn't matter. Its slow rhythm wove itself into the train's heartbeat, the steady clatter of wheels and the muted rain. I turned my gaze toward the window. Droplets trickled down the glass, merging and separating, drawing crooked lines that caught the glow of passing lights. In those fleeting glimmers, I saw our reflections, her head tilted toward mine, our shoulders touching, two shadows blurred together. The train rocked again. Her hand shifted, brushing against mine on the seat between us. A casual accident, but she didn't pull away. Neither did I. Our fingers lingered close, not yet entwined, just resting in the same fragile space. The warmth of her skin against mine was faint, almost imperceptible, but it spread through me with startling force. My chest tightened. My throat felt dry. I realized I was holding my breath. She looked at me then, not directly, but from the corner of her eye, as if checking whether I would flinch, whether I would ruin this small, delicate bridge that had formed between us. When I didn't, her lips curved into the barest of smiles. We didn't speak. There was no need. The train spoke for us, the rails humming beneath, the rain whispering against the glass, the song looping gently in our ears. Minutes stretched, folded into each other. A part of me knew this was fleeting, that dawn would break, and the train would stop, and the spell would shatter. But another part of me, stronger, hungrier, didn't care. For now, All that existed was her hand resting against mine, the muted glow of the lamp above, and the quiet certainty that something had already shifted between us. Something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to explain. The night settled heavier around the train, as though the world beyond the glass had dissolved entirely. Whatever towns or fields we passed were swallowed by darkness, leaving us suspended between nowhere and nowhere, cocooned in steel and motion. She hadn't moved her hand from mine. It wasn't a grip, not even a true holding, more like a quiet agreement that we both understood without saying aloud. The warmth of her skin was a small anchor in the vastness of the night. At some point, the song ended. Neither of us reached to change it. The silence it left behind was its own kind of music, carried by the rhythm of the rails and the faint hum of the carriage. The air between us felt thicker now, charged with something unnamed. Her shoulder leaned fully into mine. I felt the weight of her head rest lightly, almost cautiously, as though testing if I would shift away. I didn't. Instead, I breathed in slowly, afraid that any sudden movement would scatter the fragile closeness we had built. The lamp above flickered once, then steadied. Its glow painted soft outlines, the curve of her cheek, the delicate shadows beneath her lashes. In that dim light, she looked both impossibly near and untouchably far, like something you could reach for but never quite hold. We spoke less, and when we did, our voices were hushed, as though we might disturb the train itself if we grew too loud. She told me fragments, a childhood memory of summers by a lake, a teacher who once said she'd spend her life chasing stories. I offered pieces of myself, too. Nothing rehearsed, nothing polished, just small truths that felt safer in the dark. Words slipped into silence again, and it didn't matter. The night had become ours. Time blurred. The world shrank until it was only this. Her leaning against me, the muted rhythm of the train, the faint scent of rain clinging to our clothes. I hated night trains. Always had. But for the first time, I caught myself wishing this one would never end. The train rattled steadily onward, carrying us deeper into the night. Hours must have passed, though I had lost all sense of time. The compartment had taken on a dreamlike quality, dim light, steady rhythm, and her presence beside me, warm, constant, undeniable. Her head still rested lightly on my shoulder. Every so often, the train lurched, and her hair brushed against my cheek. Each time, I fought the impulse to turn, to let my face linger there, as if the contact alone could be enough. I realized how quiet it had become. The child down the corridor was finally asleep. The shuffle of footsteps, the closing of distant doors, all gone. Even the rain had faded into a faint mist, its sound softer now, like breathing. It was as if the entire train had surrendered to sleep, leaving just the two of us awake inside this fragile bubble. She stirred slightly, lifting her head. For a moment, I thought she might speak, but instead she only looked at me. In that half-light, her eyes seemed darker, deeper, reflecting more than they revealed. "Strange, isn't it?" she whispered. I leaned closer, careful not to break the spell. "What is?" "That we'll wake up tomorrow, and it'll be morning. We'll step off this train." And this, she gestured vaguely between us, her hand hovering in the air, might just vanish like it never happened. Her words hung there, fragile but sharp, and for a moment I had no answer. She wasn't asking for promises. She wasn't asking for anything at all. But in her voice I heard the same fear I felt, that what bound us was only the night, only the rhythm of the rails, destined to dissolve at dawn. Slowly, without really deciding to, I reached for her hand again. This time, there was no hesitation, no accident. Our fingers intertwined easily, naturally, as though they had been waiting for it all along. Her expression softened. She didn't smile exactly. It was subtler than that, a quiet acceptance, a silent yes. She leaned back into me, and together we returned to silence. Outside, the darkness had begun to pale. The horizon still held night, but there was a faint thinning to it, a promise that morning was on its way. And though I dreaded that morning, in that moment, it felt far enough away that I could still pretend it would never come. It was the faintest change, but I felt it before I saw it. The darkness outside no longer absolute. The window glass no longer a mirror of our reflections. A dull gray had begun to creep along the horizon, washing away the night little by little. The train's wheels no longer sounded like a lullaby, but like a countdown. Each turn of the rails drew us closer to the final stop, closer to whatever waited for us beyond this small cocoon of light and silence. She shifted, straightening a little, though she didn't let go of my hand. Her hair was slightly mussed from leaning against me for so long, but in the dim gray light, it suited her. I wondered if she realized how different she looked now than when I first stepped into this compartment. Less guarded, softer, as though the night itself had peeled back the layers of her. Neither of us spoke. It wasn't the same silence as before, heavy with possibility. This silence was gentler, sadder, as if both of us knew that dawn was a thief already at the door. The first town we passed lay shrouded in mist. Its lonely street lamps burned faintly, pale against the rising sky. I watched them flicker past, one by one, like dying stars. She followed my gaze, her eyes lingering on the blur of buildings sliding away. "How much longer?" she asked at last, her voice low, almost reluctant. "Not long," I admitted. Her fingers tightened slightly around mine. It was such a small gesture, but it struck me harder than words could. It said, "Not yet. Not just yet." I wanted to tell her that I wished the train would never stop, that the world could stay like this, wrapped in rain and rhythm, held together by music and silence. But I didn't, because saying it aloud might make the moment crumble, might remind us both of how fragile it was. Instead, I memorized everything. The curve of her lips as she breathed against the window's fog. The faint line of her collarbone visible in the gray morning light. The quiet weight of her hand in mine. I wanted to capture it all, to hold it beyond the station that was inevitably waiting ahead. The horizon brightened. The spell was breaking. But she was still here, her shoulder against mine, and for a little longer, that was enough. The train slowed gradually, the familiar screech of brakes cutting through the delicate quiet that had enveloped our compartment. Outside, the first hints of the city revealed themselves, streetlights reflecting off wet pavement, distant buildings stirring with life. She lifted her head, brushing her hair back from her face. I could see the subtle shift in her expression, alertness returning, that fragile awareness that the night we had shared was coming to an end. I tightened my grip on her hand, though neither of us spoke. Words felt inadequate, powerless against the weight of what had passed between us. The compartment that had felt like an entire universe now seemed impossibly small, the walls pressing us gently toward the inevitable conclusion. "Daniel," she whispered, the sound almost lost amidst the grinding wheels and hissing brakes. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Her eyes carried the weight of it all. The laughter, the music, the silence, the closeness that had grown without permission. I nodded, swallowing hard. I wanted to tell her everything. How strange it was that a single night could feel like a lifetime. How her presence had shifted something inside me I didn't even know was waiting. But I didn't. I simply held her hand a fraction longer, letting the moment stretch, fragile and fleeting. The train screeched to a halt. Doors slid open, letting in the cold, pale morning light. Commuters moved past the carriage, indifferent to the quiet storm that had existed within these four walls. We rose together, hesitating for the briefest second, suspended between the world we had shared and the one waiting outside. She lifted her bag, and our hands parted, but not entirely. Her fingers brushed mine one last time, a promise, a question, a memory, before she turned toward the door. "Shall we?" she said, her voice steady now, almost casual, though her eyes betrayed the same mixture of anticipation and reluctance I felt. I exhaled slowly, matching her step. Together, we stepped onto the platform, leaving the compartment and the night behind. And yet, somehow, it felt as though nothing had really ended. The station buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the hushed world we had left behind in the train. People hurried past with briefcases, shopping bags, and sleepy children, unaware of the fragile universe that had existed just moments ago inside that small compartment. We stepped onto the platform side by side, our bags in hand, and for the first time since the night began, we were fully exposed to the world outside. I glanced at her, the morning light catching her hair, softening her features, highlighting the curve of her smile, and realized I had memorized every detail already. For a heartbeat, we hesitated. Two strangers who had shared hours of laughter, silence, music, and rain, now standing in a city waking up. The spell of the night was fading, but something more enduring remained. A quiet understanding, a bond formed without words, unbroken even by sunlight. "Shall we walk?" she asked again, this time with a small laugh, as though daring the morning to challenge us. "Yes," I said, and we moved forward together. Each step felt deliberate, a subtle rebellion against the fleeting nature of night. Every sound, every motion, the hum of the city seemed sharper, more alive because we were still in step with each other, still connected. We didn't need to speak of the night, of the music or the rain or the small touches that had bound us. It was all there, invisible yet undeniable. The world might have continued on around us, but for now, our universe was ours alone. And as we walked side by side, the memory of that night, the dim light, the rhythm of the rails, the shared song, and the gentle warmth of a hand held in the dark, remained vivid. A memory that would make me smile every time I thought of it. It was strange, almost impossible, that a single night on a train could change the course of a day, a life. And yet, here we were, stepping into morning together, no longer strangers, carrying a secret joy that only we understood. The city was awake, the train gone, but the night, our night, would never leave us.